for me to open this webinar today. I won't give any particular part of the day because we're running all time zones here in this on this particular webinar. It's very late at night over in Australia, very early in the morning for the folks in the Pacific coast, very early in the morning, actually, even for New Zealand too. So from that perspective, and I know we have folks from all around the world on here on this webinar today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and a special welcome to Shannon. I'm going to hand over now to Rainer Horb, who's the chair of the eGov work group, and supporting him today is Keith Uber, who's vice chair from UbiSecure, Rainer from Austria, Keith from Finland. And just before I hand over, I have a special request from Ruth, and that's to ask you all to mute your microphones, please, so we get minimal background noise, because to remind you that we are recording this webinars just to really help you and other folks who might want to listen to it later to understand what's being said and understand the context for the slides. So if you if you don't want to be heard for a privacy reason, then don't speak up. That's all I can say. But you'll appreciate the benefit that we're trying to offer Kantara members and the broader community by recording the webinar, as well as having the slides available. And with that, Rainer, may I pass to you?
Yes, thank you for your nice introduction. My welcome in behalf of the e-government working group of Kantara to all the audience. It's a pleasure to have this new and latest approach from the Australian government's foreign digital identity framework. Just as a short intro for those who don't know the history of Kantara, the eGov working group has been one of the earliest working groups, long-time working groups now in Kantara. It used to host various more technical profiles, but always has kept an eye on work that is related to EIDs. We have a lot of European input also on EIDs, etc. We reached out to the IF working group, the Kantara Identity Assurance Framework, so there are a lot of connections in that respect. Okay, enough of ourselves. I would like to introduce our speaker, Shannon Patterson. He's the Director of Identity Policy at the Australian Digital Transformation Agency. That's a cool name, isn't it? It's just missing blockchain and artificial intelligence, but it's still a cool name. Shannon has been working on this trusted digital identity framework for the past 3 years in a small and very dedicated team. So prior working to the Digital Transformation Agency, Shannon spent over 10 years working in the Australian Department of Defence. There he oversaw the implementation of military standards for identity interop among military partners. Yeah, Shannon graduated with a bachelor and master's degree in computer security and cryptography. So before I hand over to Shannon to give a intro and presentation, I would like to frame the course of this webinar. I would like to ask you to ask questions on the chat channel or send it via email to Ruth. We will put it on the chat. And Shannon will then come back to these questions at the end of his presentation. So if our participation is growing, this will help us to have a smooth recording and collect related questions together. Okay, yeah, if you posted a question in the end, then Ruth will ask you to repeat your question in the audio once it's your turn, or she will, if there is any trouble with your audio, she can also read it for you. Okay, so Shannon, may I ask you to start with your presentation?
Thank you, Rainer. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone from around the world. This presentation is very much a high-level summary of what we're doing in the Australian government, in the Commonwealth Government of Australia, which is a whole-of-government approach to developing a trusted identity framework. We in the Commonwealth Government, when I say whole of government, I actually mean that we are working with about 10 other Commonwealth agencies to not only develop the policy framework, but also to build the systems that underpin the trust framework. In Australia, just for context, we have 3 levels of government. All 3 levels of government usually fight with each other. Different identity documents are issued by 2 of the levels. The Commonwealth Government issues passports and health identity cards. The state level, or the second tier of government, generally issues things like birth certificates, driver's licenses, other types of licenses, and different checks that people can use as proof of identity. We don't have a national identifier. We have disparate identity platforms and databases where information is held, all with varying levels of quality, security, privacy protections. We have 7 jurisdictions. We have 5 states and 2 territories. We also have the Commonwealth. So across the continent of Australia, we have 6 independent privacy acts in operation and 7 collections of privacy principles in operation. And of course, they are not all 100% compatible. So for context, the trust framework is about trying to bridge all these different differences across the tiers of government and the various policies we have in place to draw together something that we can develop so we can have a national approach to identifying people. Ruth, I believe you're driving the presentation. Could you just go down a slide, please? So just very quickly about the background. Back in 2014, or back in late 2013, actually, the government decided that to get more people interacting online digitally, we needed to review how we use the internet in Australia for service delivery. Because the financial sector is the biggest sector in Australia, the government looked at how we could get more people interacting digitally in the financial sector. There are a number of recommendations that came out of that, but a couple directly related to the need for a national approach to digitizing information, but also a national approach for how we identify people using traditional paper-based systems from across the country. That generated a couple of different government activities. One of those was essentially the creation of my agency, what was then the Digital Transformation Organisation, which has now since been renamed the Digital Transformation Agency. Through the research of the Financial System Inquiry, which was the big evaluation back in the day, there were cost models projecting what the savings for the Commonwealth could be and state governments in general if they got digitization of identity information right. Some of the numbers are upwards of $11 billion a year of efficiency if we can identify people once appropriately across the country and then use that identity to consume either government services or business services using that identity. Next slide, please. what we are doing in the Commonwealth and what we've been doing since 2014 has been the development or starting the development of the trust framework. And I'll touch on that a bit more in a sec. In the Commonwealth government though, the broader identity program that includes the policy as well as the component pieces that are getting built is what we call GovPass. GovPass is just the funding envelope that we it's the name that we have given the program, the identity program in Australia, so we can go through the finance process and get funding. And government likes names attached to projects, especially large scale projects, and so they've called this GovPass. Our financial years in Australia run from July through June, and for this current financial year, we've been given 92.4 million Australian dollars to develop a policy framework and build the component architecture that will then be used in forward years to build relying party services. The key pieces of the GovPass funding for this financial year is the framework and a couple of pieces of infrastructure. There is a Commonwealth identity provider where identity information is verified. People will provide their information, have it verified through an identity provider back at the source, whether it be a Commonwealth identity system like passports or a state-based identity system like birth certificate, or for birth certificates or driver's licenses and other types of identity documentation. There's an exchange. Similar to the Canadian model, we are going down a blinding approach. Our identity exchange is a double blind model where the identity providers will not know which relying parties are being passed the data, and conversely, relying parties won't know which identity provider was used to do the identity verification. We have 8 relying party services that we're building out to pilot over the next 12 months. There'll be up to 100,000 users per service allowed. And attribute providers is something that we're looking to build into this over the next 6 to 9 months, which are in essence authorizations and relationships. So one of the first services is getting a tax file number so you can pay tax to government. The attribute provider service is it will be used in the first instance to support connecting in with our business identity systems. So once government knows who you are, it needs to know what sort of relationship you have in business. So then you can start doing financial reporting to government. And so the attribute providers in the first instance will be to support that outcome. Next slide. Because we have such a fragmented approach to identity in Australia, if we put all our identity services online and all our government services online, more than half the people who try to identify themselves or get access to that service would fail. So it costs us a lot of money to maintain call centers, counters. We keep stats on both the positive and negatives of services. We have a country now of 25 million people living in it, and last year alone our health agency didn't answer 24 million calls. The average wait time for help to get answered in any government phone center is about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So there is a big problem that we're trying to solve. If we can get it right, what we're looking to do is reduce the cost of verifying someone's identity down from about, that says 20, but the numbers we've seen are about between 40 and 50 Australian dollars, down to about $2 per identity. So this is going to save us or enable us to realize about $11 billion in saving over the next 2 or 3 years. And then as more services come online, that number is expected to increase exponentially. For the first year of operation, we will have 8 services out to pilot beta. These are all Commonwealth government services. We are looking to do the traditional levels of assurance for identity. So 1 being anonymous, 4 being encounter with high integrity processes. In Australia, what we're looking to do for level 2 is basically a wallet test. So a driver's license and a health identity card, what we call a Medicare card, is enough to get to an level 2. Level 3 is something is a bit different to what you would probably see elsewhere. We're looking to have a few additional documents in a level 3 identity check, as well as a biometric capture, a facial biometric verified back at source on things like a passport, and over time when the system's enabled on our driver's licenses. This has never been attempted before in Australia. The technology is still maturing. The systems are still getting connected together. And currently the testing of that is, shall we say, still developing. They are not yet, even in a pilot capacity, reaching throughputs that are likely to make ministers happy. We have a 2 in 5 people fail right now with the current systems. Where we are with the developing the biometrics-based facial system, where we're at about a 5–10% throughput right now. So about 90% of the photos that get pushed through that system are failing to match on high quality documents such as passports. So there's a significant amount of work getting undertaken right now to tweak the algorithms and to make sure that the systems are being tuned in a way so that we can start getting matches and understanding why we're not getting them. We're partnering with a number of Commonwealth agencies, and we are partnering with our post office in the first year, and over time, in the forward years, in year 2 and beyond, we are looking to partner with commercial interests, both national and multinational financial institutions and the state governments. Longer term, and this is one of the questions raised via email earlier today, we are looking to grow beyond the Australian borders for the Federation, both in the policy and the infrastructure components, to include other identity frameworks and other systems. We have about 15% of New Zealand's population living in Australia, and about 5% of Australia's population is living in New Zealand. So we will, over time, be looking to extend out to New Zealand. And then beyond that, ultimately, where an identity is created in Australia, we want to be able to use that where there is any trust relationship with any other country in the world. But that is a much longer term goal of the Australian government. In terms of, I'll just read out the question. Doesn't the double blind cause problems with repair? If something has gone wrong and an ID has been given to an imposter, how can errors be corrected? What we are looking to do with the double blind is have the ability for relying party services to request additional information. So more than just what they may need for their service, if there are issues with information going through, they will be able to use back channels to ask for additional information. And with the biometric bind, we're looking to work with our policing agencies to see whether or not that will reduce the types of identity fraud that government is collectively seeing. We have in Australia an ID victim support service as well called ID Care, and they're working with us to see how we can both build an environment as well as a policy framework that supports victims of identity fraud from an operations perspective, but also from a recovery perspective. Next slide, please. So, trust framework, what is it? The trust framework basically will define how we will develop a reusable digital identity and a set of credentials that can be given to anyone if they choose to participate in the environment. It will define legally binding rules and operating requirements to govern an identity federation. And as I said, the Identity Federation is getting built by the Commonwealth to start off with, but it will grow over time to include components from different jurisdictions, state governments, in the commercial sector, and internationally longer term. Currently, it includes 16 documents. Unfortunately, I don't have the most recent versions approved for release, so I was hoping to have these available to share with everyone. That will come out in the next week and a half. So I will get my team to share those, when they're available.
Okay, thanks very much.
The trust framework at its core is an accreditation framework. It sets a minimum set of criteria that need to be met by entities that want to get accredited. And the 4 types of accreditation we cover are identity providers, credential providers, so credential being any type of authentication credential that can be used to authenticate into the digital environment. That function can be internalized within an identity provider, an identity exchange, and the attribute provider. As we said at the top, it's been developed for about 3 years now. 2 years of actual policy development work. The first year was spent a lot of time in identifying key stakeholders, understanding what the lay of the land was in areas outside of Commonwealth's purview, and building the trust of those key stakeholders so they will be willing to share their information and participate in the program. Over the last 18 months in particular, since we've developed the relationships, we've got the key stakeholder groups identified and eager to participate, we've been developing the policies, and we've been sharing those policies with the stakeholder groups as well as with more broadly the public, and we've been receiving feedback. Formally, we received over 2,000 pieces of feedback on the framework to date, and that has really helped shape the policy to meet the unique characteristics of the Australian environment, noting that we have 3 tiers of government. We have fragmented identity systems. Our government has tried to implement a national ID scheme twice in the past, and both times it has failed. In fact, the government that tried to issue it lost the next election. So governments in Australia are very wary of trying to even presents an idea that looks like it could be a national identity scheme. And when it's done, we will be legally enforceable. And so the rules of the framework will be enforced on the participants that participate in the environment, regardless of what jurisdiction they sit in Australia, regardless of what legislative requirements they need to operate to under their existing privacy obligations. So if they're in a state, for example, they have to comply with the privacy requirements of that state. Under this framework, they will also have to comply with any additional privacy obligations that the TDF sets out that are above and beyond what their existing privacy legislation is. Next slide. This is just a very quick summary of some of the history dating back to 2013, which has been the last 5 years of how long the government has been thinking about digitising services, trying to get people online, trying to figure out how to work with our state governments and other government agencies to develop identity, whether doing it ourselves or relying on third-party identity credentials or authentication credentials. The government's response to the FSI was basically what created the Transformation Office, which became the Digital Transformation Agency. And in that time, we've had 3 major releases of policy, the first being a very, very early draft back in August 2016, and the published versions being in February this year in August. A lot of the February release has been superseded now by the August, and that's the August release is what I'm talking about. That is about a week and a half away from being endorsed by our government. Once it is, I can share it with you. Next slide. You've probably all seen something similar to this. Basically defines what a trust framework is and what ours are, what the role of ours is, defines requirements, roles, responsibilities, obligations, and it's got to work and it's got to be trustworthy. As I said, government's tried this in the past, it's failed. People don't really trust government, so we need to be seen to be consulting very widely, considering the views of the many, and not trying to build a system that just meets the needs of government, because if it just meets the needs of government, it won't be trusted, no one will use it. People will continue to use help desks and over-the-counter processes, and the long lead times, wait times will continue. So there is very much a vested interest that we get the trust framework right. We take our time, we listen to people, and we write a policy framework that supports people being able to access government services. Next slide. This is probably the key slide to the presentation, which will be the structure of the trust framework to date. What we have is a requirements-based, requirements-heavy policy framework. From the top, we have an overview that says what the framework is, why we're doing it. Underneath that, we have the accreditation process, which is basically the steps that an applicant would go through to get accredited. Off to the left is the agreement they'll sign once they're accredited. The requirements cover a broad range of subject matter that they need to address, either it be minimum criteria or outcomes. And this is a work in progress. Some of the key design principles we had when we were developing this were, it's got to be fit for everyone. It can't be just for the Commonwealth Government. We have to test the policy with users, and by that we build systems that meet the policy requirements, and then test those systems with users, seek their feedback, change the policy as required. So it's this continual iterative process. And probably the key principle that I've enshrined in the team is, it's not going to be right. No matter how perfect it is, there will be always someone that has a better idea. And so it's always about doing the best we can, learning, iterating it, improving it over time. The reason why we've carved it up this way is because we don't have whole of government or whole of Australia legislation that covers some of these areas. Like I said, we have 7 legislative environments for privacy. We have 7 environments unlegislated for protected security. We have different tech standards. We have different rules and requirements for identity proofing and credentialing. We don't have a uniform way of doing risk management, and fraud control is really something only the Commonwealth does. Some of the jurisdictions do a little bit as well. So what we're trying to do in the framework is set the benchmark for all jurisdictions and the Commonwealth and how they can do these things. The key international standards that we've used are Risk Management 31000 HB 167. NIST has been quite handy for us, as have the Canadian standards and the good practice guides for credentialing and proofing. We use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 for usability and accessibility, and a Commonwealth Government written digital service standard. Tech integration, the flavour we're looking at the moment are both SAML 2 and OIDC 1. Over time, we'll also look to incorporate other contemporary tech standards. Yeah, that's probably it from a standards perspective. A lot of it, the rest of the other standards we've used are Australian or New Zealand standards, in particular for fraud control, service operations, and our protective security reviews. ProtSec reviews for pen testing. We refer to things like the OWASP and CREST for security vulnerabilities. There's a few other standards mixed in there as well. Next slide. I am conscious that it is halfway through the session, so I'll just scoot over this one. So this is our development cycle. As you can see there, it takes about 5 months to develop policy. Given our stakeholder groups, we break them up both for key stakeholders as well as the broader public. We have a month of consultation on both. Sal, I can give you that list of standards if you'd like. I don't have a list per se of what standards are used for what category of TDIF, but I can share that with you. I just had another question. Will be involving foreign critical friends in your reviews? Yes. So as I said, we're looking to interoperate with the New Zealand government in the next 12, 18 months. So we're going to start a mapping activity there. We're very interested in what's coming out of Europe, especially with GDPRs and how that may impact us and the European identity frameworks. I won't read this whole question, but I'll just touch on some of the points. We are currently developing a business model for the Identity Federation. The incentives for IDPs to join, there's significant regulation in Australia for a lot of compliance-based identity vetting in our financial sector, our gaming, gambling, telco sectors. Similar to Europe, we've got an open banking review undergoing, or that's just been completed, and in 12 months there'll be legislation where the financial sector will need to comply. So the incentives are to reduce the compliance burden on meeting their legislative or regulatory burdens. Also, one of the key strategic requirements for a government agency participating is they don't want to have to rely on the commercial sector. If the commercial sector get a segment of the market and then cease to operate in that marketplace, all those users are displaced. So the Commonwealth government and the jurisdictions will strategically go in and develop a identity system that operates in this environment simply so that they have continuity regardless of market forces. No, we will have a mix of government and non-government run IDPs and authentication services. The commercial non-government relying parties will come in after about 12 months. Right now we have a constitutional challenge, or sorry, a constitutional issue that prevents us from allowing non-government commercial relying parties joining the Federation. We are resolving that over the next 3 to 4 months, and once that's resolved, then we'll be able to have non-government relying parties join. We are starting to do some trial work with them now, but we can't go into more than research and discovery until that legal piece is worked through. Probably next slide, please, Ruth. Artie's just asked a question, is there a tendering process for third-party vendors outside Australia to be able to bid? At this stage, we're not opening it up to outside vendors, simply because we're developing the system to, basically this next year is a big test for the Commonwealth government. They're spending almost $100 million to get the thing off the ground, and they want to test it and make sure it works before we go gangbusters and ramp up. So at the moment, it's just solely focused on government, testing it with research and discovery for some local vendors, local non-government commercial service providers or relying parties. But then if we can demonstrate the value of that back to government in the context of our next budget, which is in June next year, we'll get additional funding next financial year. And then we'll be looking to open it up both with the jurisdictions, with states, with multinationals. So not yet, I guess, is my answer there, Artie. The governance framework around the TDIF looks something like what the screen, sorry, the caveat there is this is what it will look like by the end of the year. So at the moment, what we have is the trust framework with attribute providers, IDPs, CSPs, and the identity exchange. We are currently developing the rules, the operating rules, and the legal authority. And once we develop that in the next few months, that will then negate the constitutional issue we have right now. These rules will apply to all participants equally. There'll be a fair allocation of risk across the Federation, given the number of components that will be operating. The rules will be binding on everyone that joins. So the trust framework only focuses on the entities getting accredited, but the broader rule set will also apply to relying parties. So if we set a high benchmark for privacy, security, etc., for the identity system, if there is not equitable security and privacy requirements for the relying party, well, then that could be a likely attack vector for a malicious actor, and all the personal information that feeds into them will just be taken, and they'll leak like a sieve. So we're developing a legal construct that protects the users, the participants, the public that join the environment. Will have the support services to do as much to prevent fraud, to limit risk. But when bad things happen, and they will, we will also have those support services so that people can identify issues, resolve them themselves if they can, or have support from government and the services that operate within this broader environment. Does anyone have any questions on the governance model? The operating rules we don't have, well, we have drafted, but we don't have published yet. They'll be available. I can share those in probably about 6 weeks from now. Yeah, okay, good question, Raina. I'll answer that one now. The Oversight Authority, the legal authority is what, basically the Oversight Authority will be a government entity, and they'll have the dual task of developing the rules as well as enforcing them and resolving any issues along the way. That entity will have a number of support groups underneath it representing the broader views of the Australian digital economy. So we will have a working steering committee for technical and architecture matters, for privacy matters, for security matters, for usability matters, for the needs of users, to ensure that people with low vision or disabilities get a say. So what we are doing is structuring the environment so that as many views as possible can be considered, or at least identified. We don't want to have a governance structure that is just Commonwealth or just government focused, because what we will get is similar systems to what we've always had, which don't generally work well. Whereas if we have an open and transparent governance body that reports up through to the Oversight Authority, the intent is that the issues that these groups identify and feed into the Oversight Authority can then work its way through the operating rules back into the framework, so that if there are some new technologies, for example, we can have them added into the environment. They can be tested. We can test it with different user cohorts. They can become part of the framework. Systems can be accredited against them. And so the idea is that this system will grow over time, and with the transparency, we will also build trust. Next slide, please, Ruth. So that previous image showed the top-down model for the TDIF governance. This is the broader governance of the digital environment. So what we have here are two levels of governance. The inner circle, the inner scope, is what the TDIF is focused on, which is the accreditation of those 4 systems. The broader governance includes the services that people access, the public, as well as what's called the attribute verification services. So they're things that, like the databases for passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, Medicare, or health identity cards. And what's getting developed is our facial verification system. So we'll have governance across the full spectrum, the full life cycle of those systems. And over time, as those systems mature, that maturity will feed into the federation. And so we will get high participation rates, better throughput, and a policy framework that is demonstrated to work for the users, but also meets the needs of relying parties and broader government. This image is not to represent what the federation will look like when it's built. It's just to represent one instance of every participating actor. So over time, we will interoperate with other jurisdictions, whether it be with other countries or with other state governments, and they will plug in depending on what their service is. So that if we have interoperability with other nation states, it may be an identity exchange to identity exchange, for example. Or if it's a smaller state, they may have an identity system that they plug in to the Commonwealth Identity Exchange. If they're a big state like New South Wales, which has about 40% of our population, they may have their own identity exchange, IDP, CSP, and attribute provider that will connect in as well. So depending on the configuration, depending on the needs, we'll be able to use different access points where they can plug in, technically integrate, test, pilot, and then ramp up to live, all with the same governance body. Next slide. What we have here is the accreditation process, which are 5 work streams of effort that need to be undertaken for an applicant of one of those 4 accreditation types to meet accreditation. Back in the day when we were starting out, we were reaching out a lot to some of our friends, and so the second version of the service requirements for UK Verify, we had a look at and we mapped that. And what we came up with was something, we looked at what the UK Verify did for their onboarding processes, looked at what our internal needs were for Australia, and basically joined the 2 ideas together. And what we have is an agile approach, a repeatable process, an iterative process for accreditation. So once an applicant says, hey, I want to get accredited, that first step is the first decision gate where we say, all right, you want to get accredited? All right, tell me how you're going to get accredited, with what resources, how long, how will you resolve any issues, how will you meet the requirements of each of those 16 documents. The 4 swim lanes cover off all the requirements. From top to bottom, identity assurance covers things like risk management, fraud control, protective security, privacy, the specifics of identity proofing and authentication credentials, and once we've developed it, business authorizations. User research or user experience is the service design, the accessibility, the usability aspects. So building services end-to-end digitally, testing it with users, seeing where the dropout points are, fixing them with evidence, complying with things like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and our internal digital service standard. Tech integration is about making the component infrastructure work. So an identity system talking to an exchange, talking to a relying party, using OIDC or SAML. or other standards as they're developed and tested. Service ops are then all the business layer services, change management, business continuity, disaster recovery, incident management, help desks, online support services. So an applicant has to be able to demonstrate all these things at a production state. Once they can do that and they tick all the boxes, they meet the requirements, they start hitting these decision gates across governance through to service ops. Once they've met all the requirements, they get the big tick in for accreditation. They have successfully onboarded their system into the Federation. They've demonstrated it works. They've demonstrated the systems and support services that are available. They can then start operating. We will do something similar for relying party services so that we maintain that security assurance, that privacy assurance, and that, more importantly, that end-to-end user journey, that flow, because if users find it difficult, they will drop out, they won't use it. So we have always had this tension between usability and security. But I think what we've tried to do is strike a balance between what is usable and meets the needs of users, but also ensures that they have a safe journey through that digital service. Next slide, please, Ruth. So the top line here goes back to one of the questions earlier about what were our key design principles. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And what that means is identity is a very large, complex problem space. And so trying to do something nation scale, you really need to start small. And the way we've started is looking at identity, end-to-end digital identity, just identity proofing and credentialing, not even talking about accessing services or anything, but just defining the minimum requirements for that. Looking at how you can also support an offline process. So someone starts over a counter or a non-digital channel, how do you move into a digital? Connecting that into the Federation environment. And then once you've been able to identify someone digitally, give them a credential, then being able to use that access services or add in an authorizations component as well for rich services. And so what we're doing is rolling out progressively broader policy over time. Our design approach has been demonstrate value and move on. We haven't gone with what's the hardest policy problem and let's aim for that first. We want to make sure we get the building blocks right, and from that we can grow, which is why it's taken time. It's taken 3 years and we're not there yet. We're still probably about 12, 18 months away. Some of the future work that we'll be looking at is that authorizations piece, being able to prove your identity to act on behalf of a business, or being able to prove your identity to act on behalf of another individual. So you look after your mum's or your dad's tax information. We're looking to implement some policy around how we can do that, because we have an aging population in Australia, and one of the social challenges we have is that a lot of people, when they act on behalf of their aging parents, for example, they start to defraud them. So we're looking to define minimum criteria on how we get better at solving some of these problems, starting off with policy, building out solutions and testing it. There's been another question. Will the business identity and authorization information be publicly available come December this year? Yes. Current schedule for that phase 3 of work is publicly available throughout November. So we'll have a month of public consultation. And again, Colin, once we've drafted phase 3 doco, I'll share it with you. I think you may even be part of our key stakeholder group, so you'll get it mid-September, which I'm happy for you to hear more broadly.
Great.
Next slide, please, Ruth. I've kept coming back to this time and time again in this presentation, but it's very important to understand the context of Australia. We are not just building a policy framework. We are not just building an identity system for the sake of it. We are building something to enable users to participate in the digital environment. And so what we have here, just to end this session, is basically what the user flow will be. because if we don't get this right for users, they're not going to want to participate. They're not going to use the system, and they'll keep taxing our help desks and our physical channels, which is not good for anyone. So it's in our best interests to make services rich and user-friendly, straightforward to use. Exchange is where they'll have choice to prove where they want to have their identity verified, either with a government identity provider or a commercial. They'll go through the identity vetting at the IDP. They will consent to having their data exchanged to the relying party, then they'll access the relying party. The question on the chat, DTA frequently references Kantara's IAF for the TDF. Will be the same in the case of authorization for UMA? Quite possibly. I'm not looking to develop standards where we'll be pointing to existing standards. I think our SAML profile or OADC profile was Kantara's. We're looking to see what's coming out of Oasis, blockchain, some payment groups that are getting together to do some policy work with Oasis. We'll look at that once that matures. Very keen to progress UMA once our systems are mature enough to support it.
Yep, thanks. It was just, it's actually, I think, the SAML 2 profile that came from Kantara, the OIDC one, I think, came elsewhere.
Yep, so perfect. Another question, what is the model for who pays who for what? Good question. I don't have an answer for that yet. That is what our business team are working out now. We have I guess there's two tracks to that question. One is we have the Commonwealth components and the cost model that underpins that, because we need to prove that as part of our business case next financial year. But as we go with broader non-Commonwealth government participation, the cost model has to be sound. It has to ensure that the costs to participate are not such that people won't want to join, but there also has to be financial viability for participants who do join. So we're looking to find out what that balance looks like. We're looking at current approaches that work between government and non-government now to get some modelling. Next question, double blind. Does it imply relying parties do not learn about specific IDP that issued an assertion? The IDP identity will be blinded from the relying party. The data that gets passed through the relying party will see. But if there is a fraudulent activity, for example, at the relying party, what will happen is the relying party will contact the exchange who has all the mappings. The exchange will then contact the relevant IDP, and then it will start an investigation. Under Australian law, if there is a suspected identity, well, if an identity fraud event is suspected to have occurred, our federal police investigate as if the crime has occurred, irrespective of what the problem is. So they have to establish the provenance of the evidence trail. So until they're certain that there is no identity fraud or it's something else, something less significant, then they'll descale. But the relying party will have access to the data, and through its governance processes will be able to implement or investigate if nefarious activity is suspected of occurring. Next question, how did you evaluate the trade-off between cost benefit for blinding the relying parties? As I said, it's not a straight cost trade-off between blinding. It is more a case of the Australian government has tried this twice, getting a national ID scheme in place, and it has failed, and it has cost that government its government. So what they want to do is federate, but keep the various parties blinded from each other. This is to support our very strong privacy groups who don't want the Commonwealth government being able to surveil all the traffic. If it had an IDP, an exchange, and all the services, it could then just start collecting all that data and passing it to our security agencies. And so by having the blinding, and we have some protections in there, we have transparency reports, so that if there is a legal instrument placed on an IDP, an exchange, or a lying party that says, give me all your data, that entity has to make it public who asked for it, what was collected, how much was given to them over what period, and report that publicly. We will also be reporting via dashboards. So it's, for us, it's more of a political and a social imperative rather than a cost imperative for the blinding.
Thank you, Shannon, for going ahead so far and answering the all the questions on the fly. Having left just a few minutes, we'll have to curtail questions soon. So, would you like to do a summary, Shannon, or shall we solicit 2-3 more questions?
Yeah, please type away with the questions. While that's happening, I'll just give you a quick summary. So, trust framework in Australia, it's been in development for 3 years. We're looking to roll it out over the next 6 months. We'll be accrediting the first 3 providers, 2 identity providers in the exchange by Christmas this year. We will have 8 services out for pilot by Christmas as well, and it will continue to evolve and iterate over time. And we'll have legal authority getting implemented into it from October, November.
Great.
Probably the key thing I've learned developing the framework over the last 3 years is forget everything you think you know about frameworks, because you may have the best policy idea, but as soon as you come up with a cohort of users that go, that doesn't work for me, you've got to change your thinking. And so we have had so many awesome policy ideas that just never made it through the stakeholder feedback or public consultation process, because we didn't think of it on how the user would interact given their particular circumstances. So it has been a challenge trying to get something that works but also meets the needs of government and users.
Yeah, Keith is asking if telephone-based customer service sounds like a bottleneck and a key use case. Do we have an authentication method in mind for strongly authenticating a remote voice caller?
Good question, Keith. The answer to that is no. There is no method that we have in Australia where you can bind the identity of an individual to their voice print, because those 2 processes are generally kept separate. You have an identity in a digital context, and then if you get stuck, you then ring up the help desk, and then they ask you questions about your account or who you are, and then if you give it the answer, then they can capture a voice print with your consent. So we are not looking at telephony at this stage. We are looking at the shopfront process transferring into digital, or the whole digital end-to-end. Over time, though, we will come back and revisit telephony.
So we're arriving at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, I have to hold back with my own questions. I would have a couple of those. But we might have another chance once your project progresses to make a new webinar and see what the progress is.
Thank you.
So,
I'd welcome to come back and answer more questions and share where we're up to.
Yeah. So I will take care that we can push the links to your documents when they are released to our respective mailing lists. And how can people reach you when, do you have a Twitter handle, or can we share your email address?
Please share my email address. I did have a Twitter handle. I don't have Twitter handle anymore with DTA. We have corporate comms and they want to control everything. My contact details are on the end slide there. Identity at DTA is probably the easiest mailbox to hit me up with. If you have any questions, shoot them there, and I'll be able to answer them, or the team will be able to answer them pretty quickly. And when the documentation is available, I'll share that with Colin and Ruth, who will share more broadly.
Thank you so much, Shannon. So it's been a pleasure to have you on board today, and thank you so much for that presentation. I think immense amount of value has been and knowledge has been transferred, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone on the call in thanking you very much indeed for your effort. And it sounds a really exciting project, and we're looking forward to it prospering. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Colin. Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you later. Bye-bye.